So we must do two things, two great things together, to encompass that enormous new view that lies before us, but to encompass it within the framework of science, to see it within the whole categorical framework of science, and to see that these two are not separate, but that they are wedded. The bigness of the idea, the newness of the idea, the greatness of it is one with the structure of science, the structure of being itself. So we have just completed the Word as the Word, taking us from mind as mind to soul as spirit. The primal creativity, the primal elements of creativity. And now we are going to see the Word as the Christ coming in, that the Word as the Word brings forth, has brought forth an idea which is conscious of itself. We will see a kind of a oneness of subject and object, a sense of the identity of subject and object now as the idea of mind, spirit, and soul becomes itself productive. That the idea is now creative. And so life, truth, and love, that one principle which is coming to us as life, truth, and love, is really saying, I'm creating my own idea of myself. And this idea, in turn, is creative. So I'm creating my own idea of myself within you, within your consciousness, as your consciousness, and this is creative. This will be creative within you. And so the Word as the Christ will show us the self-referring quality of this idea, the ability of this idea to reflect continually back on itself, to be aware of itself, to tap or to utilize the nature of itself, to bring forth more and more and more of itself. So it's a feeding back on itself. The Word as the Christ feeds back on the Word as the Word. It loops back and auto-catalyzes itself, causes more of itself to grow. The Word as the Christ, then, as we begin, we know we're at the point of soul as soul. We're still in soul. And we have the earth. We see that the earth is symbolizing now the idea or the identity that has been formed, that dry land. And we will see that there is creativity within that idea and how it is immortalized. First, we will see it from the standpoint of soul through the rule of soul, namely by virtue of the fact that it is an idea of mind, spirit, soul, that it has within itself eternal identity. And that idea operates within its creative principle. It operates within principle. It has the infinite withinness. It is a self-conscious ego, we might say. And that self-consciousness, that ego, is held within its principle. So we will touch principle with this tone of the Word as the Christ. See that the idea is relative only to its principle, and by virtue of this onlyness of relationship, a whole system of operation is brought out. So the idea will be seen operating in the whole system of its principle, in the whole system of creation, moving in relationship to the whole of creation, according to periods of progress. And then finally we will come to life, to the fifth day of life, and see the dynamic sense of this idea that it is a moving thing, a living thing, moving through the waters and lifted ever and ever higher above the earth. If you think back to that bridge, remember what we said about the bridge, we can see now that the Word is saying to us, you have the primal elements within you. You have primal creativity within you. And now this primal creativity is resurrecting you. It is going to exalt you above anything, above anything that says that you do not have the seed within yourself, that you do not have everything within you that you need to be what you are. It will be the answer. The Word as the Christ will be the answer then to anything that says you do not have the saving power within you. You have to look outside. You have to go outside to find that saving power. You have to go outside to find your completeness and then wed yourself to that completeness as though you were a part, wedding yourself to another part. So just remember that that's what the bridge is saying to our consciousness now, that on the basis of the fact that these primal elements are not outside of us, they are within our own consciousness, that this has a resurrecting effect. This has a saving effect. This has an exalting effect to us. Yeah. So we come to the third day, soul as soul. We're in the third day, but we come to the first sense of the Word as the Christ in the third day. And we are going to see that that third day turns back on itself now and shows that that which has been identified, the dry land, the earth, in turn has identity. Now what does that mean? Two senses of identity in the third day. First, that something is identified in the sense of becoming definite, of crystallizing, of appearing as a definite form, a definite identity. Right? That's in the Word as the Word. The Word as the Christ now says that identity has identity, which means it can never not be what it is. It can never become something else than what it is. It will always be what it is. That which is remains what it is. This is, can you hear the different sense of identity? This is the changelessness of identity, the unchangeability, the immutability of that identity, the immortality. This is why identity is having to do with immortality, as we'll see in Soul as Life. And so we get that second sense of identity of the seed, having the seed within itself. Let's take our epitomes now, going to the epitomes for the first record of creation, and Let's take the overall epitome for soul to remind ourselves what that is. That soul bestows on every idea definable, unchanging, and self-reproducing identity. There are the two types of identity. And as soul, the identities of soul are ever appearing, self-reproducing. The seed is within itself. And so the text reads there, and God said, let the earth bring forth. Now, you see the earth, the identity, that which has been defined, the dry land. Let that bring forth. Let that be creative. So the earth becomes creative. Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed. There's our first touch of there being a seed. And the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. So up until this point, we had a direct creation, so to say, by God, and now it is an indirect creation of the creativity of that which has been created. The earth produces something. Yes, the earth, you see, is a symbol for the compound or a compound idea. It's a symbol for everything that has been formed up to this point, created up to this point. Symbol for the idea in its first sense of compoundness. It isn't the compound idea man, but it's a compound idea now. And this overall tone will be to show us that that compound idea is able to bring forth more and more complexity, more and more compoundness, more and more of itself. And so the earth, which has the seed within itself, you might say, brings forth the grass and the herb and the fruit tree. Then we'll see that the grass and the herb has the seed within itself, so it brings forth. And the fruit tree has the seed within itself, and so it brings forth. And we get varieties, then, of like, and we get varieties of like producing like. See that? In spirit, we had like producing like, and when we speak of like producing like, the major emphasis in spirit is on the likeness, isn't it? But from soul, when soul looks at that, soul says, yes, like produces like. Like can't help but to produce and reproduce like. So hear the difference? Yeah. So it's the complexity of the idea now that will begin to come out. Mrs. Eddy speaks there about the appearing and the ever appearing, the reappearing. These are all used in the text. The marginal headings are divine propagation, ever appearing creation, that the idea is keeping its own identity intact. Isn't that beautiful? That this is the office of the Christ. Remember what we said, perhaps you hear as you go to the deeper structure, what we found in the Dorley matrix at the point of the Christ in the J index. We had the Christ selfhood. And this is really coming out of the Christ selfhood in the Word, you know, that we had the sense of identity, soul, principle, life. Now we see that adapted to a generative sense, what that Christ selfhood of the Word is, that the Christ is that which takes the idea or is the idea and says this is the Christ idea. It is able to restructure itself, to represent itself again, always as the same thing but as something new. That's the kind of feeling here. So that you have the idea is able to keep itself intact. This is typically a Christ sense, and never changing through that reproduction. Never changing. And this is the immortality. This is just cannot help but lead to the immortality of an idea, of the idea. That an idea never comes to an end. We see its form may change. You know, as we look at each other, and we've known each other over the years, we see ourselves changing, don't we? I was talking to one of you this morning on the way over, and we were saying how beautiful it is to look around and for me to look out and to see you, and having known most of you for many, many years, and seeing such a beautiful evolution of consciousness going on and how that has changed us. And yet, at the root of that is the selfhood of the idea, isn't it? So that we are still fundamentally what we are. We change, we change. We may even change physically. We may change out of this experience into another experience, but that identity is intact. It's intact. It has the infinite withinness within it. And this is the immortality of the identity. You can't look at the mortal picture and judge that immortality. You can't say it's not true, the mortal goes out, the mortal is a pathetic picture. This is not what we're talking about. The mortal must go out. The mortal must be pathetic. This is success. This is absolute success. Behind it stands the deeper success of the identity, of the idea that each of us is. Yeah. Now, if we look at the second record, what do we find? We have the counterfeit of soul, generally. Let's take that epitome. The belief of mind in matter constitutes a sinful, instead of deviating mortal creation, a sense of deviating from the divine principle, deviating from the principle of creation, the creative principle. The belief of mind in matter constitutes a sinful mortal creation of the corporeal senses. And as soul, that physical sense with its false identification of God and man needs outside help for recreation, to recreate. So it is just the opposite of the seed within itself, that counterfeit. And what does the text, how does the text read? And the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone." You have the seed, but it is not within itself. It takes two. You see, that's the claim. Your oneness, your wholeness, your completeness is not there. What you are is not enough. This is the mortal suggestion. There's no seed. All right, maybe you have the seed, but you have to also have something to activate that, or you have to look for a seed that you can wed yourself to. There just is no seed within itself there. You need a seed outside of yourself. And so the Lord God Jehovah says, it's not good for a man to be alone. I will make him a helpmeet for him. Some kind of an outside help is needed for reproduction. And out of the ground, then, out of the ground, what else is new? It says, the Lord God Jehovah formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air, and we will see how they are brought to Adam. So, soul is that which says being has everything within itself. It is ever self-reproducing. But Adam needs a helpmeet for reproduction. And you see that it's taken out of the ground, not the earth. It's not the earth of the third day. It's not the compound idea of the third day, that identity of the third day. It's out of the ground. Hasn't everything been out of the ground? There went up a mist and watered the whole face of the ground. And Adam was formed of the dust of the ground. And now everything is taken out of the ground. Out of that nothingness, you see. And out of that sense of there being parts, that everything is in parts and pieces and bits, and that somehow the right parts have to be found and put together, stuck together, brought together. It's a wedding from outside, whereas the true weddedness is within us, of the fullness of the identity that is already there within us. So the ground is not going to provide the answer. Only the earth can provide the answer. So physical sense, this is the claim really of physical sense. It says there is something more that I need. The physical senses are always dissatisfied. They think they want something. We give the senses what they want, and immediately there's another demand, another command. Always the craving after something more. And you see, whereas in the Word as the Word and the Word as the Christ in the first record, you have the completeness coming out in the Word as the Christ. You have more and more completeness coming out from the completeness of the Word as the Word. The Word as the Word is complete. Now what does that reproduce? More and more and more completeness. We know this is true. We know it's true because we have touched spiritual things. We have touched spiritual ideas. We have touched spiritual categories. And we know that when they reflect on each other, when they are reflected in our consciousness, when they are pondered, when they are nurtured, when they are gone over, turned over and over, that they produce more and more completeness. A growing sense of completeness within us. Actually, what is wanted here and what is incomplete here is the gender, Adam is looking for the completeness of his gender. And soul is going to show us that the identity, the idea, has infinite gender within itself, lacks for nothing. The marginal heading is creation's counterfeit. Would you know if counterfeit is the counterfeit of something, thinking in terms, going back very basically to our 7 synonymous terms, which all have their counterfeits. what would the term counterfeit be a counterfeit of? Soul, yeah. And why?
Identity.
Because of identity, yes. Counterfeit is the counterfeit of identity, a negative of identity. Yeah. Mrs. Eddy says, God is presented here as repeating creation. You hear, it's not the infinite self-reproduction of the idea, but she says that everything has been created in the first record. This is the belief, this is the hypothesis, this is the attempt to create something else, to repeat creation, to have another creation going on. That the Supreme Being is represented as retrograding, you see, going back on the first creation, and man is giving up his dignity. He's really saying, because she's presenting the second record, really following, having given the whole of the first record, and so she can refer to the wholeness of that first record and the creation of man, the creation of everything being complete, being finished. And now she says God is presented as having to repeat creation, having to retrograde, and that man is giving up his dignity. So let's go on and see the rest of the story, and we come to soul as principle. In the first record, that every identity is classified according to its own gender. This wonderful concept of gender. And the earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. This is soul as principle, as we said, and what is being brought out now in that reproduction is the sense of being after his kind, that there are many kinds, and that everything is reproduced after its own kind. You see now that what the earth has brought forth, what the earth has reproduced, is now itself reproducing after its own kind. So there's order there, but there's a very advanced state of order, namely there's a sense of classification, that everything is being classified, so that there's diversification, classification now of the idea. That earth bringing forth now from within itself without limit, and Mrs. Eddy puts the main stress on gender, on the infinite gender, gender being kind, you see, that everything is after its own gender, its own kind, by soul. Soul does that. Soul says there are many kinds, and these many kinds are all classified. You get order within order when you have classification. And this is principle. Now we're beginning to see how the one identity of the third day of the earth is becoming the identities of soul. The one identity of soul holds within itself, implicates within itself all identities. All kinds are there. All genders are there. All classifications of identities are there. So that the earth that at first looks like one thing now becomes a compound of identity, because it has the seed within itself, the character of constantly turning back on itself, referring to itself, reproducing itself as identities. This is the identity principle. You see this throughout nature. You see it everywhere. You see it in everything. It's the deep structure pattern for everything. Our world is not an enemy. Our world is not an enemy. I don't really have a material universe. You know that? It's a spiritual universe. I dare to say that. Dare to say it. It's a spiritual universe. And rightly seen, we will even come to love ourselves, to love our own individuality, even to be compassionate towards our bodies, toward everything that concerns us, not to disparage that body, not to hate that body, not to say I've got to get rid of that body and this is wrong with it and that's wrong with it and so forth. But I just feel, I know that as we are touched by the true record of creation, that we begin to experience that there is no other creation. And the duality goes out, does it not? The duality will go out. It must be that we would, perhaps this point has much to do with the fact of coming to the point where we can love ourself. Love our true selfhood. I see people looking down, I see people looking out. Love myself. I don't know about that. It's going pretty far, huh? How can we not love ourselves if we are being molded and shaped and formed by the true record of creation? Yeah. Well, I said that nature is filled with this sense of the seed within itself, of the self turning back on itself. Haven't we spoken about self-symmetry, self-similarity, of the wonder of there being an iteration pattern, there being a pattern that iterates itself. Gosh, what is that pattern? Look at the first record. It's the 7 and the 4. The 7 and the 4 are an iteration pattern. And as that pattern reiterates itself and reiterates itself, it brings out pattern, more pattern, pattern within pattern. It brings out structure. See, this is why soul is principle. Soul is principle. Not just any old thing comes out, a big pile of whatever, a big pile of identity. But identity with the identity from a pattern that is pattern, pattern within pattern. When you have pattern within pattern, you have classification, you have structure. This is principle. Order which is structured. I think on the other coast we took as an example of that. If you think about, it was a kind of a spontaneous example, but thinking about, for instance, in mathematics or in the computer sciences or in chaos science, you have that great illustration of the Mandelbrot set. You remember that? The Mandelbrot or Mandelbrot set, which perhaps you can help me, Chris. It's based on an equation, a mathematical equation that is put into the computer, right? And then that equation relates to itself, does it not? It keeps feeding back on itself. You see, it's a cybernetic activity to feed back on itself, and as it does so, it keeps bringing out more and more and more of itself, more and more of its own variety, more and more self-similarity, bringing out a whole field of self-symmetry or identity, bringing out its own identity. Isn't that a wonderful example, really?
In various forms.
In various forms. And you know, when you see it, you first see it on the computer screen, you see this kind of bug-like looking creature, and it looks dark. It appears to be black, and what does it have? Three pieces, three main pieces to it, a center piece and two side pieces, and just here and there you sort of see little tendrils coming off of it. And then usually there's the ability to go in with the computer to focus in. What do they call that? To zoom in. And so you zoom in, say, 5% or 10%, whatever, and you suddenly see that what is there is a pattern that's getting richer. And as you look at that pattern, you see it's a pattern of the pattern. And that there's this beautiful variety within it. So you say, well, let me take this part here and zoom in on that. And what you find is more variety of the same pattern again, right? Do you know what I'm talking about? And yet every one of those kinds, every one of those that seem to be a repetition are not a repetition. It is a different kind of the same pattern, I guess you might say. So instead of it being absolutely identical in the strictest sense, it is self-similar. It has self-similarity within it, which is the variety within the one identity. Yes?
So you can get it on the net. It's called the fractal microscope.
Fractal microscope. Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. But it is such a beautiful example, you see, of what is happening here in soul, soul as principle, and there is no end to it. There is no end. You can sit there for 20 years and keep zooming in, zooming in, zooming in, and never come to the end of that variety. Well, what happens if we have a consciousness like that? A consciousness of the identity of the seven and the identity of the four. An identity of the levels. If our consciousness is patterned by the divine system of reference, see, patterned by principle, that this is a consciousness that knows no end. You'd think that would be the most boring thing, and that if you're going to see those seven and those four, those 15 things, again and again and again and again, that this would be the most repetitious, boring sense of existence that one could think of. And yet it is new, 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 without end. It knows no end.
Sue,
Yes.
I read that the Mandelbrot equation is really fairly simple, but it's nonlinear.
Yes. Yes.
And that's why it's infinite in its reproduction that never repeats itself.
Yes. That's right. And nonlinear referring to the type of equation that it is, the relationship, I guess, of the factors within it. Yeah.
Is that not another symbol, the seed within itself?
That's the seed within itself, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Call it the rule of soul, if you want to. It has so much to do with the rule of soul, of turning back. It just turns back on itself. It feeds itself in again as the input. It's its own input, processing, output, and feeding back to input again.
Don't you think, Sue, if it comes from a personal sense, that's the limitation. That's what limits the music, the feedback. We're not in the cybernetic flow at that point. We're coming from the wrong sense of I.
Yes, the wrong sense of I. Yeah, a personal I.
Yes.
An I that is personal.
We know that we haven't got it.
Yeah,
And we have to do more.
another
to
ego.
lift that dimension, as you mentioned, to itself.
To
Let it
itself.
coming out
Yeah.
itself and not through personal sense.
Right.
It's in the glossary, with Euphrates. The last thing it says is this Euphrates is the only error is limitation.
Yes, very good point. I was feeling so much that sense of rule coming in here, and hadn't realized, and I hadn't really recalled that John Dorley would characterize each of the 29 standpoints with generally two different ideas. And when I went back to check that, sure enough, he characterizes soul as principle as gender and rule. Gender and rule. And you see that a rule is cybernetic. It implies a loop. It implies the looping back to mind, spirit, and soul. And that is how the infinite identities of identity are brought forth. Infinite kind or gender. The Hebrew rendition of the seed in itself is the seeding seed. The Hebrews would say this is the seeding seed. The seed seeds itself. It plants a new seed of itself. So that is the ability of the idea, the compound idea within us at this point in the whole development of that creative act, that creative activity. And we see that it has so much to do with offsetting, as you said, the limitations. You mentioned the limitations that we have. This is why we don't like ourselves, or we don't like others, because we perceive limitations within ourselves, we perceive limitations within others, and the first limitation that we see is that there are only two genders, and we are only one of those two, and that we feel then that we only have those characteristics and qualities that go with that gender, and that we have to find the other characteristics that belong to the other gender. And it's a dividing up of the whole field of identity instead of a sense of the abundant translation, that we have with the Word as the Christ, we divide up the field of identity, divide it into half and divide it into a duality of opposites with distinct offices, and really suffering to some extent from that claim, actually suffering a great deal from that claim until we work it out, until it is worked out through the first record of creation that the second record has no power and is in fact an illusion. It's just an illusion. Absolutely an illusion. That we have infinite gender. So let's look at that illusion. The second record, soul as principle. Unsatisfied cravings develop only on the basis of animal genders and qualities. So that unsatisfied craving develops, it continues to grow. The Lord God brought every beast of the field and every fowl of the air to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. It's a funny thing, God bringing everything to man, to Adam, and saying, well, what would you call this? How do you identify this? Saying to mortal man, what do you think about this? Would this satisfy you? Is this woman? Is this woman? Is this woman? And as though a real good takeoff on our tendency to try to classify everything. Don't we try to classify everything? Oh boy. And to identify everything and put it into a classification. And so instead of that true classification, you get that false classification. Everything is animal in gender. And Adam gives the name and the nature to these animals, really identifying himself, and identifying out of himself and identifying himself, because everything is subjective, really, isn't it? That he was identifying himself with animal qualities, and that's always leading to unsatisfied cravings when we identify with animal qualities, isn't it? Hmm? Yes. This creates the sense of wanting to devour the other one, wanting to eat them up, always looking outside, preying on others, the beastliness within the mortal is all the animal nature, the false animal nature, because we know in the first record, when we come to the sixth day of creation, we get the true animal qualities. Do we not? Huh? We'll see the place value of the true animal qualities as they are forming and serving the basis of what man is, of what our true manhood is. So here it is, the beast of the field and the fowl of the air, the beastliness and the preying sense of that fowl of the air, the false classification of man and of everything within man's purview. So we come to soul as life. The identities of soul are incorporeal, and therefore immortal. And we have that very simple text then, and the evening and the morning were the third day. And we know that without Mrs. Eddy's exegesis and without the work of John Dorley and the subsequent work of Max Kapler, that we wouldn't have a clue as to what this means in terms of being systematic, of being in the system, of being soul as life. What does this mean? In which way is this soul as life? Mrs. Eddy apparently and John Dorley could feel inherently that soul must go to the point of life, that it must have that fifth tone, that the seed within itself can't help but to demonstrate immortality. That infinite gender demonstrates immortality. The immortality of the self-sameness of identity. And so Mrs. Eddy speaks there about all kinds of wonderful things that one would never think of. She says the third day now corresponds to spiritual understanding, to resurrection. Resurrection being an idea of what synonymous term? Soul. And you hear the life sense within soul, that resurrection. That spiritual understanding corresponds to reappearance, to a stage of ascending thought, and she says it is the third stage of ascending thought. And she says this is life. It is deathless, dependent on no material organization. That spirit is life. And then she gives Jesus as an example of that. Jesus, who exemplified the Christ, we're in the Word as the Christ now, showed this forth perfectly, apparently. She says he reappeared. You see, after he was put into the grave, put into the earth. Now you can take that two ways. Put into the earth, put into the ground. Which earth was he in? In the primal elements, yes. He reappeared to his students. This was soul. The identity, he was able to reproduce his identity again. But to his own students, this appeared to be life. This seemed to be life to them, you see. So she gives two standpoints showing soul as life and that identity cannot be destroyed. The standpoint of Jesus, that for him it was the demonstration of soul, of resurrection. It was the resurrection aspect of his experience, not the ascension aspect, which for him then would have been life. But for him it was soul, the reappearing of the third stage in his ascending thought, she says. But for the students, for those around him, it was the appearance of life. The demonstration of soul appeared as life. To their apprehension, he rose from the grave and so presented to them the certain sense of eternal life. You even hear a translation there, don't you? That what was soul for him translated itself to life for them. They needed to see the demonstration of life. What was life to them? Yeah. Big point, yes. So it wasn't the highest sense of life, but the sense of life which was understandable to them. Yeah.
And to us.
And to us, we are them, aren't we? Yeah, it's understandable to us, yeah. So this is soul as life, that soul is immortal. Otherwise, all could be lost, you see, if soul were not life. For soul to be soul, it must be life. Or else an identity is not an identity. Spiritual understanding could go backwards. There could be a reversal, could be lost. But the identity is eternalized. And this is what we see in soul as life. So we will take a break at this point, and then we will go on to the second record of creation and see what is being handled, what is being dealt with by that great scientific fact. Okay?